The Siege of Akhulgo took place between June and August 1839 during the Caucasian War between the Russian Empire and the Caucasian Imamate led by Imam Shamil. General Grabbe laid siege to Imam Shamil at the stone fortress of Akhulgo. After 80 days, the stronghold was captured and most of the defenders were killed, but Shamil managed to escape. Geography. About 75 kilometers west of the Caspian Sea, the Andi-Koisu River flows eastward to meet the Avar-Koisu River, which flows northward. Together they form the Sulak River, which flows northeast. All three rivers run through deep gorges. Around 5 kilometers to the south lies the village of Gimri, where Ghazi Muhammad was killed in 1832. Akhulgo is about 5 kilometers to the west. At Akhulgo, the Andi-Koisu River flows east, then north, east again, south, and once more east, forming a rough rectangle. Within this rectangle are two steep hills rising several hundred feet above the river. The western hill, known as Old Akhulgo, is narrow and stretches from north to south. It is shaped somewhat like a comma and can only be easily approached along a narrow ridge from the village of Ashitla to the southwest. The eastern hill, known as New Akhulgo, is broader and higher. Between them flows the Ashitla River. At a narrow point in the gorge, the two hills are connected by a bridge 40 meters above the Ashitla River. South of New Akhulgo and beyond the rectangular area stands the Ciri Tower, cone-shaped, taller than the other two hills and dominating the entire area. In addition to the steep terrain, there are natural and artificial caves, as well as semi-underground houses. This location was a natural fortress, whose only real weakness was the difficulty of accessing water from the river. Construction. 1837 expedition. In 1837, General Fezzi destroyed the village of Ashitla and later killed a group of fugitives who had fortified themselves in Old Akhulgo by bombarding them from the Ciri Tower with artillery. Shamil observed the ruins of Ashitla, which likely influenced his decision to fortify New Akhulgo. See the Murid War for more detail. March to Akhulgo. The plan was to attack Akhulgo with two columns, one from Fort Vnezapna, modern Endore, 45 kilometers north of Akhulgo, and the other from Timir Khan Shura, now Buynaksk, 30 kilometers to the east. Since Shamil had many supporters in the north, the main force came from the north, while the eastern column was primarily used for supply purposes. Possibly to avoid the Avar-Koisu Gorge, the eastern force planned to travel south, then west to Kunzak, and then north to Akhulgo. The march began from Vnezapna on May 21st. All dates are in the old-style calendars, so add 12 days to the Western or Gregorian calendar. On May 25th, the Russians dispersed a group under Shamil himself at Bertunai with minor fighting. They then encountered the fortified village of Argwani, now modern Argvani, although its exact location does not entirely match Baddeley's description. The village was difficult to assault but too strong to bypass, and there was no time for a prolonged siege. On May 30th, 31st, the fortress was shelled with artillery, stormed, and its population massacred. Russian losses were 146 dead and 500 wounded, while the mountaineers may have lost up to 2,000. The Russians then faced the challenge of crossing the Andi-Koisu and linking up with a supply convoy waiting on the high ground near Baddeley, south of Akhulgo. They captured one of the destroyed bridges, rebuilt it using roof beams from nearby villages, crossed with some of their troops, and established contact with the supply convoy. On June 11th, they repaired the bridge at Trikata, and on June 12th, they occupied the ruins of Ashitla, less than 1 kilometer southwest of Akhulgo, thus beginning the siege.
The siege. Shamil was now trapped with around 4,000 people, including over 1,000 fighters. Baddeley does not explain why the women and children were not evacuated. General Grabbe commanded approximately 6,000 Russian troops and 3,500 native militia. Observing that the troops positioned on the northern bank were in danger, on June 14th he withdrew them to the southern bank, a decision that proved to be a mistake. During the night of June 18th to 19th, the Marids secretly reoccupied Ashitla. Had they acted more aggressively, they might have achieved something, but they were driven out the following morning. Capture of Ciri Tower. At dawn on June 29th, artillery was fired at the Ciri Tower, but with little effect. The attack began at 9 a.m. The attackers nearly reached the summit, but could not advance further. The attack was aborted at dusk with 300 casualties, 36 killed, although the Marids suffered even heavier losses. Heavier guns were brought up, and on July 4, the bombardment resumed, quickly reducing the tower's summit to rubble. The Marids continued to resist, the assault troops were pulled back, and the bombardment continued. Realizing all hope was lost, some of the remaining defenders attempted to break through the Russian lines. When the final attackers reached the summit, they found only a few wounded men. Russian losses on the final day were just 12 killed. The Russian line was now shortened and relieved from fire coming from Ciri Tower. Siege works were pushed closer and new batteries were established. On July 12, 3,500 reinforcements arrived, giving Grabbe a total of 10,092 Russian and native militia troops. Both sides were now semi-besieged. Shamil was still able to receive some supplies from the north, while Grabbe had to haul his through dangerous territory. The main difficulty lay in transporting artillery shells for the bombardment of the fortress. Third assault. 3 columns were organized. The strongest would attack New Akhulgo east along the narrow ridge. The second would assault Old Akhulgo west, and the smallest would move through the Ashitla Gorge and swing in either direction depending on the situation. Bombardment began at dawn and lasted until 2 p.m. The infantry advanced and launched the assault at 5 p.m. The eastern column took the first outer positions on the ridge, but then encountered an unknown trench. 600 men became trapped in a narrow space surrounded by cliffs on 3 sides and a narrow path for retreat. Darkness alone saved them. Had they acted more aggressively, they might have achieved something, but they were driven out the following morning. Russian losses amounted to 156 killed and 719 wounded, while the defenders lost around 150 men. Stalemate and final encirclement. A full month was spent strengthening the Russian positions at the cost of only 100 men, but due to poor sanitation, Russian strength dwindled to 6,000. Grabbe realized that Shamil was still receiving supplies and reinforcements from the north, so on August 4, 2 battalions crossed the river and positioned themselves north of Akhulgo, completing the encirclement. A covered gallery was laboriously built leading toward New Akhulgo to move troops safely and secretly. Shamil's position deteriorated further. He was attacked from all directions, water could only be fetched by climbing down the rocks under enemy fire. There was no wood for cooking, the sun was scorching, and burying the dead became nearly impossible. Negotiations were attempted but failed. Fourth assault. The same 3 columns were used, resulting in the same failure. Russian casualties were 102 killed, 162 wounded, and 293 bruised from falling rocks and slips. However, Shamil had now lost most of his fighting force. He raised a white flag and offered his 12-year-old son as a hostage. The next day, General Pullo was brought to the rock for negotiations, but it became clear that Shamil had no intention of surrendering.
Final assault. 5th assault, August 21 to 22. The final assault began on August 21 and again failed. The following morning, the attack resumed. The Russians encountered little resistance and successfully captured New Akhulgo. They discovered many fugitives climbing the cliffs or trying to descend to the bridge leading to Old Akhulgo. Tarasevich's troops entered the gorge, climbed up, seized the bridge, and reached the summit of Old Akhulgo before the garrison could respond. The 2-day battle cost the Russians 150 dead and 494 wounded. Among the dead was the Georgian coronet David Goreyili, the last prince of Guria. Since most of the remaining defenders refused to surrender, fighting, or outright slaughter, continued for another week. Every house and cave had to be taken one by one. Men were lowered on ropes to search for caves along the cliff sides. Mothers killed their children. Some people threw themselves off cliffs. Women and children attacked with bayonets, stones, and daggers.
Some pretended to surrender only to kill their captors. Tarasevich died this way. More than 1,000 bodies were counted, and 900 prisoners, mostly women, children, and the elderly, were taken. By August 29th, no one alive remained on the rocks except the Russians. The 80-day siege had resulted in 512 Russian dead, 1,722 wounded, and 694 bruised, in addition to uncounted losses from disease. The Russians searched for Shamil's body but could not find it. No prisoner could or would say where he was. Shamil's escape. Shamil's second wife, Javarat, was killed during the siege, and his sister Fatima threw herself off a cliff. On the night of August 21 to 22, before New Akhulgo was abandoned, Shamil, his pregnant first wife, Fatimat, their young son, Ghazi Mohammed, and a few followers lowered themselves into a cave above the river. The next night, they descended to the river, built a raft, loaded it with decoys, and let it float downstream. While the guards were distracted, they slipped downstream along the riverbank and turned south up a ravine. They encountered a guard and killed the officer, though Shamil and his young son were wounded. They returned to the river, bridged it with planks — Baddeley's geography here does not match Google Earth — and made their way northwest. Within a year, Shamil had rebuilt his power base in Chechnya. Grabbe withdrew from the mountains and sent his troops to winter quarters. Akhulgo was never inhabited again.